You've been replaced. By Saz. Charlie woke up this morning on the other side. That's the first theory that finds its way into his thoughts, at least. It was pitch dark when his phone chirped at 8 in the morning. He opened his eyes, and it was as if he had never opened them at all. This wasn't the moment Charlie began to notice something was amiss. He'd lived in Anchorage since he was 18, almost 10 years now, and Alaskans don't see much sun November to February. It was nearing mid-December, so he wasn't expecting daylight to hazily drift through the frosty clouds for another hour and a half at least. He went to flip the light switch his muscles instinctively knew how to find in the center of his royal blue-painted wall next to the bedroom door. He lived in the fairly small guest room of his more successful older brother's house at the moment while he searched for a second job that could pay something close to the ridiculous amount they're asking for rent in the last frontier nowadays. Nothing. Both in terms of well-paying jobs around Anchorage and in terms of success when Charlie flipped the switch and hoped for the temporary, jarring blindness of morning's first light. He jiggled the little white piece of plastic back and forth a couple times just to be certain. Definitely not working. Still, Charlie didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary. It seemed every time a somewhat severe storm blew through this neighborhood, there was a new tree just waiting to fall over their power lines. It had just happened last month, and they had to run the generator to keep the house warm almost all day, thanks to how lazy those power company people were. Technical difficulties, my ass, Charlie thought to himself as he tapped his phone flashlight on and prepared for another power-free day. The wind did sound like it was blowing pretty hard the night previous. There would probably be all kinds of trees and limbs strewn across the road as he drove to his morning shift, cleaning up around a dingy hospice. He actually didn't mind the job so much and wasn't nearly as put off by all the elderly folk on their way out the door as he was when he first got hired. He just wished they could scrounge up a bit more than a measly $12.50 an hour for the friendly janitor guy they all seem to like so much. Okay, I'll stop telling you what didn't alarm Charlie now and finally unveil what did. Dry toothpaste. There Charlie stood, phone positioned on the counter, leaning up against the wall so that it semi-lit the sink and parts of the rest of the bathroom. His bathroom. His brother Kalen was nice enough to let him have the downstairs bathroom, while he made his wife and 9-year-old kid all share the somewhat larger one upstairs together. Hand extended into the sink, gripping his toothbrush he topped with a little white line of special toothpaste that was supposed to help his gums stop bleeding. Nothing. Again. The arm of the sink was firmly pulled all the way up, and Charlie stood there as if waiting for the sink to realize it needed to wake up and do what all the other sinks do to make a living in this world. Nothing. No electricity was one thing. No water? Something must be wrong. Now, Charlie's idea of wrong wasn't exactly, I'm somehow conscious in the void that comes after life, at that moment. It was more something like, Kalen's doing one of his stupid construction projects that rearranges the whole house again, and he failed to tell me he was going to cut everything off right before I have to go to work. The former idea only began to weave itself into his imagination once he opened the front door. Before that, he looked up the stairwell, ascending into further darkness, 3 steps away from the front door. I'm giving your phone number out to the first senior citizen who tells me I smell like a hooligan today. You'll be fielding all complaints about my hygiene, Charlie yelled up to the brother he assumed was up the stairs. There was no response from Kalen or his wife Gwen. He didn't hear their son Corman doing his morning laps around upstairs either. That kid was the reason Charlie was up earlier than his alarm was set for most days of the week. All was silent up the sleek cedar staircase that bitter morning. That was the moment. Charlie opened the front door to walk around the side of the house where he assumed Kalen was standing in his tool shed, working on whatever had resulted in the power and water being cut off. That was the moment he saw it. Or didn't see it, more accurately. Nothing. There was nothing outside. There was no outside. Charlie took a step quickly in anticipation of his foot hitting the single stone step between the house and the front yard. His hand still gripping the doorknob was the only thing that saved him from falling face first into the endless black. As his foot went farther and farther down, the sudden realization that where he expected to land wasn't there at all caused his entire body to tense. He put more weight on that doorknob than any doorknob should take as he scrambled to get one of his knees back into the house and leverage himself up. He figures the reason it didn't break under his weight and send him spiraling into nothingness had to be because Kalen built the damn thing himself out of some special, high-quality materials. The knob was definitely cold at a touch and heavy like iron. One of those construction projects Charlie had called stupid earlier. Once Charlie had pulled himself back into the floor of his brother's house and given himself several minutes to hyperventilate, he crept to the edge of the doorway and looked down. He shined his phone light down for good measure. The house stopped cleanly right below the floorboards Charlie currently clung to. He could reach his arm out and touch the underside of the same floor he was currently on top of, but he was too afraid to venture any limb back out into that blackness. That's all it was in all directions. Blackness. Nothing. It didn't feel like he was floating or falling, just suspended in complete silence and stillness. Nothing moved other than himself. Nothing creaked or chattered or howled. His eyes made desperate circles around his new locale, wanting nothing more than to find some point of reference. That's what eyes want. Something to let you know you're this close to this, which is that close to that other thing. But all there was nothing. That was when Charlie started to believe he'd crossed over to the other side. What other explanation was there? He always suspected that was all there was after death. He didn't think he'd be conscious for it, though, or that he'd take most of his brother's house with him. What happened? He was 27. That was way too young to have a heart attack in his sleep, right? And he only took Percocet when he hung out with Jace and the other guys he used to share an apartment with. The guys his brother had been actively trying to get Charlie away from. The last time he hung out with them was over a month ago, so no way they took any of that fentanyl-laced bullshit and faded out. Charlie supposed it didn't matter anymore. He was in the blackness, and there was no one around to answer his questions. He went through every room in the house, hoping to find life besides himself in the darkness. After finding nothing, he began to feel guilty for wanting someone to be there with him. Why would he wish this on anyone else? It was pure selfishness to even think it, but being in an endless void with someone else is better than being in an endless void alone. Concluding he was, in fact, alone in the suspended house, Charlie sat on the floor 3 feet from the last doorway before the absence of anything. It hadn't even been 30 minutes and already he felt trapped. His brain filled the deafening silence that refused to stimulate his ears with deep roars and loud ringing that he knew was only sourced from his subconscious. He wondered if there was a bottom. If he jumped, would he hit something eventually? Would he fall forever? Would he be swallowed by a cushion of knot that made his mind as black as the void? He started to put his head into his hands and accidentally blinded himself. He was holding his phone in his left hand and pointed the light directly into his eyes when he dipped his head down. His phone? It was the only electricity he had. The only light. The only thing he had truly been able to interact with in the limited space between himself and the blackness. There was no way the thing had reception. Where's the closest cell tower to was never and will never? Charlie thought that'd make a good slam poetry bar and a piece about how materialism is frivolous after death. Why was he making jokes at a time like this? And why was his phone actually entertaining him with the low hum of a ring after he brought up Kalen's contact? "Telemarketers Anonymous, this is Kalen speaking," the older brother said with not-so-subtle sarcasm on the other side of the phone and the other side of wherever Charlie currently sat. Had Charlie even been awake an hour at this point? Still, his brother's voice brought him to the verge of tears. Except Kalen thought it was a scam call and was probably about to hang up. "Wait! It's Charlie! I swear!" "Okay, why are you calling me, Charlie?" Kalen said while staring at a new mark on the wall he was sure Corman put there. He was thinking of the best way to cover it up or get rid of it while speaking to the restricted number with his little brother's voice.
I'm in trouble,
Charlie responded.
I don't know where I am. I'm in your house, but I'm not at the same time. I don't know what to do. I thought I was dead, but if I can call you, I guess I'm okay for now.
Kalen was having trouble trying to process this. Was Charlie high? His little brother was rambling. His mouth moved quickly, and the things it spewed were nothing short of certifiable.
What the hell are you talking about? When did this happen?
Kalen said, confused and starting to get a little frustrated at the idea that Charlie had regressed to the point of dropping acid before work again.
I don't know. Sometime overnight. I just woke up in this place. It makes no sense here, man. I can't even get a sense of direction. I don't know how anyone could find me, but you have to try, please.
Charlie said, trying not to allow a childish whimper into his voice. The more he talked about his situation out loud, the more he lost control of what used to be subdued feelings.
You were fine this morning, Charlie, Kalen said. I thought you said you called out of work. Where did you really go?
Nothing. Charlie's response was nothing. What could he say to that? The continued release of the well of emotions, barely kept in check beforehand, now saw Charlie in the fetal position he used to like to sleep in until high school. His most primal desire in such a moment of barren confusion and hopelessness was to be embraced by something. Anything.
It's not true. You're lying,
Charlie said, shaking and barely able to get the words out like squeaks through a teary throat. Nothing. Now it was Kalen returning the silence. Kalen had hit a similar wall of mad feelings, albeit with the pillowy grounding of his own reality around him that prevented melting into a mess on new flooring like Charlie. He was staring at something that provoked his newfound silence. His mind racing and holding perfectly still as if waiting for the danger to pass by all at the same time. Charlie thought the silence may have meant his phone died, so he checked the screen. Still kicking. 20%.
Who is this?
Kalen said, trying to force a giggle, but getting out more of a grunt.
It's Charlie,
the little brother said, suddenly feeling tired as if the demoralization was complete, or his adrenaline had run dry.
I told you. I already told you.
I'm looking at Charlie right now, Kalen said as the second wave of adrenaline moved over time through Charlie's heart and mind.
He's outside shoveling the driveway. Who is this? How are you doing this, Charlie?
Here's the part of the scary story where one, if not every party involved, ponders if this is all simply a dream. Some madly detailed mind trick of a nightmare that illustrates how the true fears the endless depths that construct the human imagination. But Charlie's already given himself more than enough pinches and slaps to put to rest that theory. In his nightmares, he always woke up far before there was a chance for the killer to catch him, or before he had the chance to fall and hit the ground. He would wake up at the first thing to make his body kick or convulse in his bed. He had been kicking and convulsing for an unknowable amount of time now, if time is even a hand that ticks there. It was real. He was wide awake in a world that looks like closed eyelids. If there were walls and ceilings, surely they were carved in infinite obsidian. He wasn't shoveling the driveway. He hadn't shoveled the driveway. When had he ever shoveled the driveway before?
That's not me! I swear that's not me!
Charlie wept, gripping his knees so tightly into his face that it muffled his tone slightly.
This isn't funny at all, Charlie. I was really scared for a second.
Kalen said, angry, but also lighthearted at his wonderfully comforting revelation that Charlie had discovered some elaborate way to play a prank on him. Obviously, he wasn't actually laughing off his real brother being trapped in some existentially horrific situation, with Kalen shrugging him off as his lifeline. Kalen would never be able to live with that, so that's not what was happening.
How are you even doing this?
Kalen continued, laughing now as Charlie struggled to breathe and articulate some counter to his brother's denial.
And wait, why am I even still talking to you on the phone? Charlie could feel it coming. Kaylin's thumb was headed directly towards that red circle that wrapped up their final conversation. Red circles usually signal warning. Red circles are what coat young soldiers who lay dying in a field in some godforsaken place. It's not uncommon for a red circle to be followed by waves of black. Please, was all Charlie mustered out of his lungs before a descending tone signified the end. Kaylin was already out the door at the house in our reality. He approached the thing that looked and talked like Charlie and congratulated it for leading him on for so long. It crafted a decent story on the spot explaining the prank to cover its tracks. Something about a burner phone and a pre-recorded message. The explanation falls apart pretty quickly if you put too much thought into it, but Kaylin didn't want to think on it too much, just escape from the nightmare. Charlie took much longer to calm his hyperventilating chest and frantic thoughts this time. He lashed around on the floor like an angry child who wanted his toy back. It's not fair, he thought, continuing this streak of jejune behavior. He was permitted a childlike breakdown given the situation. It's not like there was anyone around to see him degrade himself. The innermost thing that motivates us springs out when we're alone, and at a viscerally intense point. It's a child every time. Our flesh simply grows large around the baby we never truly stop being. He looked at his phone again. 10%. Who could he call before losing his phone for eternity? Should he even waste his only light source just for someone else to not take him seriously? His uncle, the one who raised Charlie and his brother back home in Rock Springs, Wyoming, was in a home for his rapidly progressing dementia. A home similar to the one Charlie works in, or used to work in. None of his friends would ever believe him. They're junkies. Charlie never said that out loud, and would fervently deny it when Kaylin tried to confront him about it, but he always knew it. If he called Jace, then Jace would probably just call Kaylin since he's the responsible one, and then the prank narrative would just keep pushing itself forward through whatever thing was shoveling Kaylin's driveway with Charlie's face right now. Answers. With that thought, Charlie realized his last phone call would be to get answers. Maybe he could accept his new place in the void if he had that much. He dialed his own phone number and pressed the far more inviting green circle that signaled momentum and beginnings. It rang 4 times, and then Charlie was talking to his own voice. Why are you doing this to me? Charlie said, cutting to the chase as quickly as possible with his 9% battery remaining. You've been replaced, the beast with Charlie's voice and likeness told him. You get to move into my home, and I get to move into yours. I look like you, and soon enough you'll look like me. Charlie would wait to process all of this after his phone died. He couldn't pause to breathe or cry anymore with 8% battery left. He needed a better explanation than just that he's been replaced. You can't just move into my life. What gives you the right? Charlie said, trying his best to keep composure and keep on track. I had friends, a job. You were failing, the beast said, standing out in the woods so his new brother Kaylin didn't develop any new suspicions. He wasn't too worried, though. Kaylin would do whatever mental gymnastics he had to keep living in the home he created with the family he made. No intruders allowed. Your job is pathetic. Your friends are pathetic, the beast continued. You have no more claim over your life than I do. You drifted in and out of control, and when you take your hands off the wheel, something else can put its hands on. I'll take your pieces and create something so much better. Nothing. Charlie told himself he would keep the questions flowing, and once again he was left with nothing. Was that a sign that he couldn't argue with the beast? He had lost control of his own words, his lead in this conversation, and what little mass he had some claim over in the expanse of his own universe. One more chance, Charlie said,
his initially assertive position reduced to all he had left, begging.
Just give me one more chance and I'll...
Descending tone. Call ended. 3% battery left. The beast had nothing more to say to what used to be Charlie. It had his memories now, his life, his personality. What could the old Charlie explain to the beast that it didn't already know? It thought Charlie would like the void anyways. It's the perfect place to relinquish control and let the endless river carry your driverless vessel. He could just drift forever with no purpose and nobody to tell him otherwise. The beast got in Charlie's car and hoped to make it to Vancouver within 3 days. It didn't think Alaska suited Charlie well enough. Charlie stripped his clothes off and used the last of his light to look at himself. 2% battery left. This was him. This was all he had. He touched his fingers to the chest he always said he'd tattoo but never could think of the right design. He touched them to the leg he used on the kick drum of the kit he begged his uncle to get for him for the better part of 3 years. The kit that was still in Wyoming somewhere because he couldn't fit it in his car before he moved up to Anchorage. Charlie wanted to make sure he knew what was him and what wasn't before the light went out. It could be so easy to forget in the dark. 1% battery left. When he was certain his body was his own, he walked to the edge of the house and dropped his phone into the void. He had hoped the light would illuminate something familiar, or just that it would shine on anything at all. He hoped to hear a thud when the phone hit the bottom, too. He didn't see any of his hopes realized. All he saw was a light quickly swallowed where no light could exist, and then he was truly alone. When there's nothing to see and nothing to hear, the mind begins to conjure tricks. Charlie thought it had something to do with when the beast said, "Soon enough you'll look like me." He thought he could feel his hands and feet becoming pieces of the void. He could still feel the floor his older brother laid beneath him, but maybe that was just a hallucination too. Maybe he had already stepped off and was falling. Would it feel any different than laying on the floor? Charlie was so curious. What is movement in relation to nothing else at all? What is falling with no imminent ground? Maybe he would step off and find out. Maybe not. He had nothing but time to decide. Nothing.